Kostis, Dr. Kourelis, is an architectural historian, archaeologist, and associate professor of art history at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His fieldwork focuses on settlements, landscapes, and vernacular architecture of migration from the medieval period to the present. And I believe he's just returned from Greece very recently. He also explores the history of humanitarianism and the relationship between radical art practices and archaeology during the 20th century. And his current fieldwork centers on refugee camps in Greece from 1821 to the present, Japanese incarceration camps in the American West, and Philadelphia's Greektown, which is a really remarkable array of research topics. I know that you have been here a number of times with your students, with other programs going on, so we're delighted to have you back, and welcome. We can't wait to hear what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I want to warn you that I'm going to show you many images because I'm in no way an expert on the Greek community of Lancaster. And much of what I want to argue is built around different geographical and different temporal contexts that I want to build for you. It's part of a sort of a larger project that involves doing research in Lancaster, in Philadelphia, in Harrisburg, in Greece. So please bear with me as I dazzle you with images. But before we get started, I want to say one thing in case there's ambiguity. In my title, which I'm still playing around with, I use the word metabolism not only because much of this work is built on Dr. Zervanas's research, and I'd love to have a medical metaphor. I use the word metabolism because I think there's two radically different ways of historical agency and how immigrant communities have worked in American history. One sort of privileges the character, the cultural support group, the religion. It makes a narrative about sort of individual choices and in some way analyzing the communities internally and giving them a special role in decision making. On the other side of the explanation of option is a much more materialist, what might be called Marxist explanation, where economics, material needs overcome the role of the individual. So I'm trying to find some way in between to locate immigrant communities as neither great heroes, individuals, or communities that are by their own sort of cultural power able to persevere, neither just blind puppets of economic forces in class struggles and immigration. So I think the Greek community is particularly interesting in that respect because when you think of their numbers, they're tiny within the American historical setting, and when you think of their position in the different kind of options, employment options, urban options, they very often played the role of oiling the engine of something that was kind of happening at a much grander scale. Food is very important. Sweetness is very important. Tobacco is very important. And I wanted to start with this image showing you north of Queen Street that shows you Lancaster at the peak of the progressive era, and we'll define that in a second. A hustle and bustle of people that have arrived through industrialization, through urbanization. You can see the trolleys, you can see great masses that have never lived so closely together. And you see all the stores, commercial, industrial, educational. And I want to point attention to just one over here, which gets buried along the bustle of this period. And you can see here the Lancaster Candy Company. And that's sort of the Greek presence, the Greek contribution in the preparation of sweets and chocolate that I'll talk about in a second. When I talk about the progressive era, we're speaking about this period after the Civil War and pretty much before the Great Depression. And the reason why this is an interesting period is not only because we have the flooding of the gates and the open immigration policy for Eastern and Southern Europeans, but also have an intense development within the city by kind of a philosophy that through architectural organization, through urban design, through urban planning, and through rational decisions, everything will take care of itself. The class differences will resolve. Businesses will be responsible for taking care of the community, and sort of free enterprise will, in many ways, solve the problems of old Europe. So in this progressive era, there's a lot of investment in connecting humans and technologies. It's about moving America from a very provincial, very isolationist early 19th century identity into becoming the leaders of industry, the leaders of the world, which after the war, after World War II, we know obviously they have reached that status. So the progressive era is that moment of transition from an isolationist kind of backwards country, has the Civil War, sorts itself out, industrializes, urbanizes, and becomes a modern country through this very special recipe of private enterprise, humanitarianism, business interests at first. So it's really hard because of that chaotic sort of forces of the capitalist American modernity. It's really difficult to identify who are the agents that participate in this change. We can identify for definitely the technologies, oil, steel. We can identify the industries. The social structures of proletariats and producers. But it's very hard to find those metabolic individuals in between that support the changes within the mechanism that oscillate between the physical world and the intellectual world. I know that sounds like a very large leap to make. So I want to put the Greek contribution to American society precisely in that translation between the material world, the mechanical material world of modernity, and the intellectual, emotional world of the subject of individuality through the kind of material that they are beginning to manage, through those materials that enter our bodies quite physically, and they're not simply nourishing or keeping us alive, but they begin to feed our imagination. Chocolate, flowers, cigarettes, right? They're a special kind of material that are allowing for the modern project to become more coherent and more individual. Anyway, a lot of theoretical things. This is not going to be, it's going to be much faster than what, but I wanted to pause for a second and define what I mean by metabolism, like thinking of a connection between humans and objects in a medical metaphor, where you have the chemical reaction that takes energy and material, but transforms them into a different thing, and then ultimately becomes invisible at the end of the operation, at the end of the cycle. All right, so Greek archaeology. When we think of Greek archaeology, of course, you think of ancient Greek archaeology. What is the Greek archaeology doing American history? Stay in your lane, Professor Kourelis. I'm interested in the archaeology of Greece, not from the monuments of the classical antiquity, and of course, from its, the great significance that it's had for the building of the American nation, right? After all, classical America is built, the Lincoln Memorial is designed by an architect who was in fact excavating in Assos in Greece in order to design of course, the Greek monument then becomes the stage for Martin Luther King's March of Washington in 1963. So there's a presence of the Greek because of its resonance, the classical Greek, and of course gets even recycled in Barack Obama's campaign in 2008. And as you can see here, Lincoln Memorial is the background for the inaugurations. What I'm interested in, although of course I love that Parthenon, I teach it every year, what I'm interested in is the later accretions, the slightly less beautiful accretions that come around the world of Greece in its medieval period, in its early modern period. This is what the Parthenon, in fact, looked like before classical archaeologists sort of stripped it down, drawing by Stuart and Rivet from the late 18th century. So I'm interested in that mosque in the middle of the Parthenon. I'm interested in the Parthenon as functioning as a church dedicated to the Virgin. I'm interested in all these people that have built their houses and storage spaces. Here's a plan of the Parthenon, of the Acropolis, and you can sort of see here's the Parthenon, here's the mosque. Here's the hill, the South Hill, where we have, for example, one of the most, the first kind of refugee-built community. This is a neighborhood right under the feet of the Acropolis that was built by the Masons who were building the modern nation, and in spite of the classicists trying to ban them from building this chaotic island-like community, they ended up becoming permanently settled there. So this is part of the Acropolis that most classics books don't cover. Another part of the Acropolis, which is absolutely fascinating, and here's just this, stay tuned, are the hills down on the south slope These are the hills that have caves. Of course, everything that was there was cleared out in the 19th century by archaeology, but we have evidence that this was actually the center of a freed slave community of Ottoman African slaves that gained their freedom and lived in the caves right under the Acropolis. So these are the kind of things that fascinate me. The Acropolis that inspires Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, and ideas about progress, ideas about democracy, but also the Acropolis that's below the hill, that's the substructure that exists in later times and gets us in perhaps a little more complicated contemporary questions. So I'm an archaeologist of the medieval world and early modern world. I'll show you very briefly what I usually do when I'm not looking at Lancaster. Here are the places that I've worked in Crimea, in northern Greece, Peloponnese, in Sicily, and in Tunisia. Excavation I will never be able to return to is the excavation of the Byzantine city of Chersonesus in what used to be Ukraine. And you see a bunch of stones. I'm an architectural historian. I'm trying to figure out how these dead walls become metabolized into a life, how they become used into a reasonable and logical community. So, for example, in this excavation, we have two households. Sorry, we have two houses, two families from the 12th century. This is, of course, a very important Byzantine site because of the conversion of the Russians into Christianity, which is why it became such an attractive destination for invasions and Russian identity and Putin and what have you. But in the 12th century, you see we have a kind of these two households. And as we excavate this room over here, I'm sorry if you can, what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring my own. There we go. This room here that has the sort of peculiar apse, we find a whole set of burials, in fact, about 70 burials that are the people that, in fact, used and made this space alive. So these are the kind of things I look in the archaeological record. And I'm going to point out here just a couple of other excavations, which are not adult humans, but fetus burials. They're in the house, in the rooms that the family uses. Here's actually a photo from another excavation in Corinth that I myself excavated, which is an example of what a fetal burial looks like. They're put in in some way they're thought to be still part of the body of the mother. These are typically very often they lead to the death of the mother, but because they're not quite fully in some way born, they are still part of the feminine realm, and they do not make it to the Christian cemetery, but they stay in the house. And they anyway. But here in Greece, when I work in Greece, okay, that was Crimea. When I work in Greece, I look at the landscape from a very long horizon. My dissertation research was in the Peloponnese, where a small community of the Lancaster Greeks originate from. And I studied the shift in the landscape from the ancient settlement to the medieval settlement, and then finally the modern village, and what are the choices that are made by those individuals to make that transition. You see here, for example, there is this simultaneity of occupations. Here is the medieval village. You can't quite make out the house, but here's what it looks like. Then the modern village right below. Here's the mountain onto which we look down in. Or in the case of further down the slope, we have this Crusader monastery. This is a Cistercian abbey. And you might say, what are the French doing in Greece? This is after the Fourth Crusade. So we have this really interesting moment of French, Greek, Catholic, Orthodox, rural folks trying to sort things out. So the evidence for that is the walls, the actual masonry of the church. And you see here, students are slavishly doing drawings of each block so they can put it back together, so that they can reconstruct it, so that we can have a beautiful Cistercian abbey and we can figure out what went on. So that's what I usually do. So now, how do I get from that into thinking about the archaeology of migration? Well, one thing I should say is that in 2016, as many of you know, Europe underwent a kind of a wake-up call when hundreds and thousands of Syrian refugees started crossing from Turkey into these 4 islands, and then ultimately settling into the Greek mainland on the way up to Northern Europe. I was with my students doing field work on some mountain village, and then we their parents were watching the news, seeing this on every major national newspaper. So we adjusted the research in a way that you can only do at a liberal arts college to address the refugee crisis, and then create a different kind of strategy of thinking of migration along different periods, not only in the medieval period, but in the early modern, the late modern, and the current. At that time, I should say, here's the island of Kos. This artist was documenting the settlement of the Syrian refugees as soon as they landed. And very interestingly, this is not this island of Kos is exactly where many of the Greeks of Lancaster originate from. So I became really interested in that sort of temporal and spatial disconnect between a community who immigrated 100 years ago that is watching on the news the arrival of a different group, and trying to figure out how this becomes materially relevant. So just to give you, this is not what I'm going to talk about it, but I'm going to give you a short version of it. What we ended up doing with the students is keeping track of all the refugee camps that the Greek government was establishing. Then recording them in the 1 month that we usually have doing field work. These are, of course, tent cities. And then thinking about the site choice, why they were placed there, what is the historical landscape around which they were placed. We started focusing on one called Koutsokero, which very interestingly was right across the road from a 1920s refugee camp from another era. And it made me realize that Greece is a unique case study where you have constant migration, so it's never a crisis. In fact, when you don't have a crisis is when you have, the crisis in some way. So I devised a kind of a larger research plan that's very diachronic. So the army camp from the 1950s was the place where the government put the Syrian refugees right next to a 1960s quarry, and as I said, across the street from the later. In fact, in the 1920s, right after pretty much World War I, 2,089 refugee settlements were built by the League of Nations, directed by Americans and supported by many humanitarian organizations. And you see the map from the League of Nations map of where those were. And those have completely disappeared. People know it as a part of the experience of Greece, but there is absolutely no memory of them on the landscape. But you see 1924, here's this middle-class family from Asia Minor dressing up on their Sunday's best to create a postcard to send to some family member in the same landscape where 100 years later, we have another population. Okay, so one of the major moments of migration in that long stretch of constant movements of people is the period between 1880 and 1925, approximately, where 500,000 Greeks came to the United States, about 400,000, 500,000. 1 in every 4 working age male of Greece came to the United States. That is a radical demographic shift, right? And of course, they're caught in the camera of the great WPA photographers like Arthur Rothstein. You see, this is a Greek cafe neon, Greek coffee shop in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. And here's a view of what would become the Greek town, a dense settlement in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, closer to Pittsburgh, that would be would have an ethnic concentration. So I want to turn to Lancaster and say, I am completely indebted to the introduction of the history of the Greeks of Lancaster from Dr. Zervanos, who's here in the audience, who wrote this amazing book on recording every family, every source of origin. So this was back in 2008, 2009. Without works like this, my work would be impossible. There would be no starting point. So I want to thank Dr. Zervanos and everyone in local communities who is organizing family archives, who's donating to Lancaster History, who's making sure that the legacy of their past will be saved for the future. The problem is that ethnic communities don't think themselves as worthy of commemoration because they are the metabolic agents. They're not the leaders of industry or the owners of the steel mills. So it's especially important to have records of those moments. The moment between leaving a place and entering American middle class, those 20, 30 years of real strangeness and discomfort, and where the metabolic process really occurs. Anyway, I'm also very much indebted to Barbara Karpouzis Valavanis, who I met when I started here at Franklin and Marshall, and I just had the honor of interviewing her a couple of times before she passed away. And so I'm really indebted to these two individuals who are the true historians of Greek Lancaster. And I want to apologize in advance for whatever I say, which is probably not grounded in the way that you're used to grounding things. So we talked about Greek towns. Every ethnic community in the United States that settled in a major city cluster around these ethnic neighborhoods. Very often they would be centralized. They'd sometimes be more dispersed. Here's Lowell, Massachusetts, that shows you all the different towns of the immigrant communities. There's the Greek town, there's the Polish town, Greek district, Polish district, Portuguese district. Lowell is particularly interesting because the Greek minority, because of the mills, was one of the biggest minorities, which is unusual. The Greek story disappears because statistically they're so marginal. They're less than 1% of the population. So it's really kind of striking. How can a group that is less than 1% of the population leave a kind of a cultural imprint on the life of the city, where you know of the diner, you know of the Greek caricature, you've seen it on Saturday Night Live, you've seen it on the Greek festival at in May. But what I'm trying to recover is the time in American history where these communities were coherent. You can see some kind of memory of them in major cities. Here's Los Angeles. It's called the Byzantine Latino Quarter, which is so amazing. Basically, the Greek town of the 20th century is very Hispanic right now. So the mayor of LA decided to create this kind of mixture of Byzantine Latino, which is just so fabulous. There's practically no Greek living in that neighborhood. There's still a Greek grocery store across the church. The church is there, but everybody just drives in from the suburbs for Sunday services. Same thing with the National Hellenic Museum, the only national museum of Greek heritage in Chicago. It's in Greek town, and I'll show you what that what that means. And here's Detroit, where the idea of Greek town becomes an ethnoscape, something to be marketed and has really no connection to Greek towns. So why do we have the loss of Greek towns? Why don't we have the Greek towns of the early 20th century? Well, the answer is pretty simple. World War II happens. A lot of these first-generation immigrants return from the GI Bill. Because they're white, they pass and they assimilate, and they do white flight into the suburbs. So they leave behind these neighborhoods to the poorer members of the city, African American, Hispanic, and they create new churches, they metabolize one more time in the American suburb. In places like Detroit, literally Greek town gets destroyed. I mean, in 1960, the Detroit riots happened right in Greek town. And if you read Jeffrey Eugenides' fabulous novel Middlesex, you get this sort of story that because of many of the diner owners did not have the kind of the racist assumptions that the rest of American society had, the rioters would kind of mark the Greek restaurants and the Greek confectionaries so that they wouldn't be destroyed. But anyway, after this, and as Jeffrey Eugenides says, that's kind of the moment where the Greeks were like, okay, we're done. Let's move on to the suburbs of Detroit. And same thing with Chicago, urban renewal. Greek town, one of the biggest, most famous concentration of Greeks. At some point, it was the second largest city of Greeks after Athens, because it was impoverished after the Greeks left it, as part of the federal funding for building of this highway and building a new campus for the University of Illinois. It was razed. It was completely razed and disappeared. So what is Greek town now? It's just a little bit over the side, right? A little bit over the side, with some institutions like a museum, but it has no relationship to the original Greek town, which is under under this. So let's think about Southeastern Pennsylvania. So the biggest city, of course, in the area is Philadelphia. And many of you know that urban renewal in Society Hill in Philadelphia happened through the clearing of the area of the mall around Independence Hall. It's kind of a very interesting kind of slum clearing project. And you might wonder, right, it's a federal program, but what is the Park Service, which is usually in Yosemite and, doing in the city, is because the city had no money to actually carry this out. This project, however, is extremely important because it's the beginning of American archaeology. For the first time, archaeologists tackle the material remains and create what the field that we know today as historical archaeology. So look at this picture. That's 1964, after everything has been razed, right? Look at Carpenter Hall here, Independence Hall in the distance. This is what it looked like. Carpenter Hall here, Independence Hall in the distance. So this is what was cleared out. So it's become an archaeological project, isn't it? The ethnic life of the cities. Chinatown was saved because of activism. So here's a group that in Philadelphia, that would stand behind the bulldozers and say, you cannot destroy. So we still have an ethnic community that's known as Chinatown, whilst other places are completely forgotten. So where did the Greeks go? Well, here's an article from 1962. City's Greek quarter loses out to medical college expansion. It's because of that metabolism. They're so interested in medicine. I'm just kidding. So Jefferson Hospital expands. And as you can see, the heart of the Greek quarter of Philadelphia between 10th and 11th Streets on Locke Street, and it's not going to be there anymore. That land is going to be used by Jefferson Medical College for a new science building and a student commons. The Greeks are going to have to move. They seem not in the least perturbed. They're like, take me out of the inner city. I would like to go to the suburbs, just like all my other white ethnics. So basically, a Greek town, 10th and Locust, here you can see it feels like you're in Athens with the markets, with the diners, with the signage, becomes the Jefferson Hospital, Jefferson College's beautiful library. So the earliest church, 1908, the Annunciation from 12th on 12th Street, gets sold to an African-American community, a Baptist community, just like the Greek church here gets sold to an African-American community. And it creates 3 other suburban churches, whereas St. George Cathedral, which is the later one from 1921, 1922, that one actually stays. It managed to survive through some very interesting mechanisms, but it provides 3 other satellite communities. And in those suburbs, you get the new church, like the church here in Lancaster is a product of this sort of 1950s reinvention of the Greek identity, these beautiful objects in a sea of parking, very convenient for Greek festivals. The Greek festival as an institution gets created precisely because you need to fundraise to build those churches. There were no Greek festivals before the suburban churches, right? How would you go to a Greek festival like in Center City? Like, where would you park? Like, what would you do? Like, and why would you go there when there's like Greek restaurants all around you? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, interesting. So let's flip over to the Greek side and let's consider what is if every immigrant community is having a double life, every immigrant community is building its institutions in Philadelphia, in Lancaster, in Reading, in Harrisburg, but they're also supporting entire communities back in their home country. So my interest is what are the remnants of what we call now remittance architecture? What is the remnants of remittances that are sent back by these American communities? The statistics are staggering. I'm told you 1 in every 4 working age person. The Greek economy, 20% of the GDP was remittances. I mean, it makes comparison to, Mexico's statistics are lower than that. So what has happened to that contribution, to that metabolic connection between supporting not only these rising communities, but also the failing state that caused the migration out? And typically those are rural communities, rural villages. And you say, well, rural villages should, there's no urban renewal in a rural village. So why can't we go back to the rural villages and see those houses that were paid by American funding? The problem there is you don't have urban renewal, racial tensions, riots, economic downfalls, but you have war and civil war. Here's an image from Time magazine that shows you how many Greeks lived after World War II. This is from Life magazine from 1944. Famous photo of a crying girl and writing what the Germans did to Greece, showing you a village of Distomo. When under the Nazi occupation of Greece, there was this principle that if any partisans or resistance fighters killed a German soldier, then the German army would go and kill 20 civilians as reprisals and burn down the village where that occurred. So if you think about this, it's it's kind of a heroic moment. It's sad, and it creates this devastated landscape. In fact, one of the first things that the Marshall Plan tried to do after liberation was to rebuild those destroyed villages. And look at the statistics. Here is a mapping by really important urbanist who as part of his humanitarian watch is to map every destroyed village by the Nazis after World War II, present that in a big conference in San Francisco, and really go to the Nuremberg trial and say, look, Germany, you need to compensate us. But as we all know, in post-war politics was a decision to not criminalize Germany and make sure that we don't have what happened after World War I. And sort of forget those individual costs through other means. But look at that, 18% of the population, 18% of every house, every village here is destroyed, right? So there goes the remittance archaeology that I'm looking for. Okay, so let's see now, how do we get out of this impossibility? Now, on the one hand, we are thankful to Dr. Zervanos, to the local communities who are collecting oral histories, who are saving the books, the prints, the icons, the material culture of that transmission. But you also have to remember that heritage is partly self-selective, but now it's only those that remained that have stories to tell. But also that generation is slowly disappearing. So that window has closed where an ethnographer or an anthropologist can get an answer to these questions of what actually happened. The situation in the US is also quite interesting, is that unlike every ethnic group that just had a major exodus at some point in history, for the Greeks, 1880, 1925, and then stopped, and then the gates close, and and we have legislation from the government that says no more immigrants, we're done. But then, if you remember, because of all the devastation in the countryside of the Nazis, Americans as liberators and also as the country that committed to rebuilding Greece, created a new kind of wave of migration. So all these starving, poor, destroyed villagers are coming to the US again. So we have two phases of migration, completely unrelated, very interesting how they work with one another. But we have a rare opportunity where we have an ethnic group that gets recharged about a generation later, and therefore retains its memories and its connection back to the homeland. It's also of the first generation that came, that 500,000 that I mentioned to you, half of them actually went back. They didn't even stay. So that connection between Greece and US is a very unique and peculiar transnational codependence. So when we do the history of Greek America, the first thing that we have to worry about is what are our sources beyond the church histories, the oral histories. So we have these wonderful Greek guides that were printed by communities in the early 20th century. They're basically catalogs of, you want to migrate? This is who you're going to go to when you land in Reading, when you land in Lancaster. A list of all the businesses to which you will find your first point of contact. So once you map out those, those directories, you see that these communities are also spreading throughout the United States. Unfortunately, the Greek American story has been written from the point of view of the two largest cities, New York and Chicago. So what it's failed to recognize in this little study that I'll spend some time talking about, that this is a map of the demographics of the Greek community based on the 1909 records. And you see that here are here's Chicago, here's New York, right? Here's Philadelphia, but most of them are tiny little circles that have approximately 100 Greeks, 100 residents. So what is the story of the immigrant in the small town, which seems to be at least half of the story of the Greek experience? Different national groups have different patterns of migration. Like the ones that we're more familiar with are factory workers that come to, like, for example, the Polish experience is very much about going, not stopping in Philadelphia because Philadelphia doesn't have enough factory, it has enough work, but it's not booming like Pittsburgh is. So the Polish immigrants, once they land in Philadelphia, they just keep on going because the factories are thriving in the steel industry further inland. So the Greeks are finding themselves in a service niche as part of a kind of an urban progressive revitalization that is happening throughout the American nation, and I'll explain why. So anyway, so we wanted in this case study, my colleague David Pettigrew, who's also a Roman archaeologist, but who teaches at Messiah University nearby, and has been doing seminars where he's been digitizing the census for Harrisburg, and has been doing a lot of work with the communities that were lost in the building of the new Capitol building. The new Capitol from our state capital was another early slum clearance project and ultimately displaced many immigrant groups and African-American groups. So he's been studying through mapping all the demographics. What is the racial and cultural and ethnic interchange in 1900, in 1910, in 1920, in 1930, in 1940? You can do this with a city like Lancaster and Harrisburg. You can't really do it. You could if you have a lot of resources, right? But David and I, to a certain extent, basically have these freshman seminars where we take like 10 pages from the census and give it to our undergraduates and say, okay, try to make sense of it. The next year we do the next one. Ultimately, you can collect enough to write a narrative. So we got together and thought, well, what if we compare this to from a small town to small town perspective? Like you'd assume that what happens in Harrisburg is same population as what happens in Lancaster, and it's probably different than what happens to Philadelphia and certainly Chicago or New York. So I want to put this in your radar. Do check out this website, Digital Harrisburg, where Professor Pettigrew has been kind of posting a lot of the data sets. You can almost go in and go block by block and see if you're in Harrisburg, who lived when at each different time. So there's the data sets, there's the exhibitions. This is something I want to talk about. This is our last project. This is, having just returned from Greece, what I'm mostly excited about. So just a footnote, David Pettigrew is a Roman archaeologist working in the Corinthia. So this last summer, we brought students to Corinth in search of the first refugee settlement in Greece from 1829, which is a town that this Philhellene Samuel Howe built with donations from Philadelphia and Boston and New York, a refugee settlement to house all the dispersed populations that were being massacred during the Liberation War between the Ottomans and the Greeks. And it had disappeared, like all these refugees had disappeared, and we found it. So we're really excited to talk more about this. And if you click on this right now, you'll see a video project from one of the students who was in our team this last summer, who is kind of reporting the process of finding this settlement, which was named Washingtonia. That's pretty cool, isn't it? There's a Washingtonia in Greece that it's disappeared, and we've it's been known in the sources, but no one knew exactly where it was, which is very peculiar because it's right around the corner that in 1896, Americans established their most continuous archaeological presence. And it's always puzzled us that Americans were thinking of archaeology as something that applies to the classical period, but here's something that was 20, 30, 40, 50 years earlier that's disappearing in terms of their own eyes, but they've never recorded it. So here we come to kind of bring it back out. So the study, and I can pass this around if anybody wants to see it, came on an issue of Pennsylvania history that that focused on the City Beautiful movement, and I'll say more about this. And I could spend the whole talk sort of talking about differences between Lancaster and Harrisburg, but I'll make it really short because reading dots on a map is not the most exciting thing to look at. The thing that we discovered is that there is a same size, pretty much the same era of communities. The process of using the urban landscape as an instrument for betterment or survival is very, very different. We note, for example, that in Harrisburg, there's mostly males and not families, and they spread out along a much greater area Whereas in Lancaster, they're much more concentrated and they're a lot more balanced in terms of male and female. So we've noticed through just plotting them and where they live and what choices they make, we've noticed some really micro differences that I think are worth talking about, so that the small town immigrant experience can be discussed. The thing that was also kind of a great discovery for me is that I've always, we've always been working on the Southeast, the 7th Ward, always been considered to be the kind of the melting pot of Lancaster. I've had these great interviews about relationships between African Americans and Greeks that are very special here in Lancaster and unusual for other cities. And it was kind of shocking to find out that that although the Church Street and Greek Town in some way was remembered to be around here, where the church is, where a dense concentration of there was a Kos Street where everybody from Kos lived. In fact, Mrs. Alvanis told me, "Oh yeah, everyone here was from Kos except one. There was one foreigner. There was one family from Chios, from another island." But in fact, it's really quite distributed much more broadly. So this is actually very consistent with what I'll show a little bit in Philadelphia, where the real estate choices that the Greeks are making are more driven by their commitment to the service industry. So they keep on moving where there's a business opportunity, and they have to be close enough to the commercial center because they have to walk to it because they're serving it. So that creates a kind of a different environment and relationship to the city in a sense of community than one which is a little bit more industrialized, more dispersed. So what makes this moment so important? Well, I define architecturally the progressive era through the World's Columbia Exhibition of 1893, right, which is the first time that America got a World Fair. First it was London, then it was Paris, then it comes to Chicago. And you notice that it's dressed up in this sort of classical, it's kind of classical vocabulary. And the idea of this project is that through the power of the built environment, you can solve all the problems of urbanization. So the City Beautiful movement arises from here. The idea is that if you can take elements from here and disperse it through any American city, then you will build an enduring institutional framework. We see that also as the same team that designed the Chicago World's Fair designs our mall. Right, the 1902 commission, McKinley Commission, that gives us, after all, the Lincoln Memorial, like all the things that we see, that is a dream of using the physical environment. So the City Beautiful movement translates differently. In Philadelphia, it is the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, designed by Paul Cray, that regularizes and beautifies and therefore uplifts the moral character of this melting pot, of this very dangerous environment where people of different creeds and colors are coming and have no direction on how to solve each other's problems and work together. Here in Lancaster, of course, it is Seamlin Urban, right? After all, isn't it the these classical buildings that are informed by the Chicago World's Fair? Here's a 1965 photo that shows the Brunswick Hotel right before demolition, and then the Hilton coming in as we know it today, or the Brunswick as we know it today. But if you notice, like right around the corner over here, there's something called the Coronet Nightclub, which is the Greek presence in some way, kind of filling itself in. Yes, there is the classical framework that could be, it's something you could use, like you could spin, especially if you are in an environment of nativism where your American hosts are telling you that you're not white, which is very prominent among Southern Europeans. And then the Greeks always say, well, if you think I'm not white, then what about this? Because I brought you this, right? So therefore we are the same. So there's a lot of cultural capital invested in using classical antiquity, although most immigrants knew nothing about the Parthenon and didn't really care very much about the actual chain of transmission. So anyway, but in fact, they fit in that framework through their through the luncheonettes, through their confectionaries. Here you see it a little bit better demolished. So we turn back to that city, right? Here's the City Beautiful movement in Lancaster, a completely rebuilt late 19th, 20th century urban environment in a pretty traditional colonial era framework, right? With they're right here. Of course, this is torn down for urban renewal. For the City Beautiful movement. And that's the Greece Tower, that skyscraper, the first skyscraper, or the second perhaps skyscraper if you consider the, anyway, yeah. So these Greeks are essentially the proprietors of the Lancaster Candy Company. So here is the family that's behind this institution. And I thank the LancasterHistory.org for having those images, and I thank Dr. Zervanos for making sure that these images make it into the repository. Evangelos and Maria Manolakis. This arguably is the first Greek to be born in Lancaster, I think, Dr. Zervanos. And he partnered with John Roumanis in the Lancaster Candy Company and created what you saw as the in the photo. Here's an example of these immigrant business directories. This one is from 1915. They're published in New York by the same people that are publishing the Greek newspapers. There's, as in every community, at least as in every Greek community, there's always two churches, there's always two newspapers, there's always two political parties, but I won't get into those details. Lancaster was saved. There was only one church, whereas most other cities were divided along two political, and I won't get into the details, two political parties back in Greece that had a very radical vision of what it was to be Greek. One more royalist, the other one more democratic, republican in some way. So here is our our list of Mandis, Sarlas Mendis, and Stathopoulos on North Queen Street, Roumanis and Manolakis, 6th and 8th North Queen Street, and the same for Harrisburg. And of course, the list for Philadelphia is a little bit longer. And here is once again an old photograph. Here's the Brunswick. And here just you kind of vaguely see the Crystal Restaurant. Notice that in the 1965 photo, sorry if I go back, the Crystal Restaurant is already gone, just an empty lot, right? Although the Coronet is also owned by Greeks later on. Anyway, so let's go back for a second. So that's the presence of the food. And of course, the reason why I wanted to highlight the Crystal Restaurant is because the energy that occurs between community and community is something that's also very visible. The family connections and the entrepreneurial management that happens in these confectionaries is really unstudied. So the reason why there are so many confectionaries and floral shop is because they're creating a distribution system that is very connected. So basically what happens is that you open up a confectionery as one person. If it happens, then you get a couple of cousins to come from Greece. And if that succeeds, then you start a new one. The Olympic kitchen or your distributor is giving you the finances that you need to start the new one, but you're dependent on buying all the products from them. So particularly within a circle of Arcadians by the 1920s, there's a distribution network that goes from like Florida to Hawaii. And these cute little confectionaries are these incredible kind of business organizations because they're saving on the transportation of their raw material, and they're also saving on the labor costs, so they can compete in the labor market in ways that other immigrant communities can't. They're having that source of kind of free labor, and they're having a very sophisticated entrepreneurial system of investment. So the reason why I bring this up, because the Crystal Restaurant is the same family that owns the much more famous Crystal Restaurant, Crystal Palace in Reading, the Mantis family from Vlachokerasia, a village in Arcadia that I'll refer to. Oh gosh, I gotta go faster. Here's the Crystal Restaurant. The reason why unfortunately there was a devastating fire, it's closed down. But here's a postcard from the 1960s. And this is a very, very fascinating mural. The reason is because we know from archival sources that William Baziotis, the most important expressionist of, abstract expressionist in New York City. I mean, this is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He grew up in Reading. And in fact, his family worked for restaurants. And we know, I've looked at his archive in the Smithsonian, that in 1941, he, as a favor, does the mural for the Crystal Palace. So I haven't proven this yet, but I think that this is a Basiotis. Anyway, stay tuned. Same thing with another unheard, really important modernist. This is Byron Vazakas, who was friends with Basiotis from Reading, hanging out with Carlos Williams, one of the most important poets of the literary modernism, with poems like Try Traveler, Midsummer Clouds Start Blue on Lancaster above St. James Graveyard. Wait, he's writing a modernist poem in New York City about Lancaster, right? What's going on here? Lancaster, something is happening that's worth commemorating. And you can see Demuth is being referred to, Drive Eastward, like the dreams, past car barn, jail and reservoir, past school, past marble stoops that oddly plague the mind, like street dust modeled to the smell of rain. I mean, it's not a traditional city, it's a traditional city that is connecting up to modernity. After all, anyway. I can go on all the, Stevens, all the Pennsylvania poets that have a local connection, but I'll leave it at that. The thing that's most fascinating out of all these discoveries is that, in fact, there is an Olympia Candy Kitchen. Olympia is a name that you find very frequently in the network of that network of distributors, Olympia Candy Kitchen. And there is an Olympia Candy Kitchen in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which is sort of right here on Central Square, that still survives. So this might be the oldest surviving confectionery in America. Well, okay. The City Beautiful movement in Harrisburg is much easier. You take the slums and you replace it with the state capital. So here it is, our Washington, D.C. implanted with the promise of fixing all the urban ills. But the thing that I love about this publication this is a publication on the Architectural Journal that shows its sort of first manifestation, is this door right here. And I won't say too much about, I will, but not as much as others. It's a sign for tobacco. You can kind of see it. It says Murad. And Murad, of course, is the Anargyros tobacco family. Although sold as Turkish cigarettes or Egyptian cigarettes, this is the equivalent of, these are basically plants from Macedonia, Greece, that are shipped to New York and Philadelphia, rolled by hand by Greek immigrants, and then sold at this very sort of elite market. It's only 20% of the tobacco market, and of course, the Duke family is going crazy. How can they bust this Greek monopoly? Knowing that Greek tobacco is different and superior, and also hand-rolled, not machine-made. And finally, 1913 or so, I think that's when finally they bust the market by creating the blend between Virginia and Mediterranean tobacco, which is called Camel cigarettes. And you might notice there's a camel and so behind all that Turkishness and all that Egyptianness, it's all Greek. It's 100% Greek. And the reason why the reason why we call it Egyptian is because in the Ottoman Empire, Egypt decided to monopolize the export of tobacco. So all the Greek manufacturers ended up in Cairo, and the same families that were making cigarettes in Cairo moved here to the East Coast. There's the Anargyros School in Spetses, remittance architecture, funding an entire academic organization in 1927. So these are the kind of books that the Greeks are using. Rigby's Reliable Candy Teacher will give you a ground plan very quickly. If you have the capital and the labor, you can pop up a confectionery. And I want to highlight this other book where I'm going to pass this along. Anne Flesser-Beck, just a couple of years ago, did research on her family confectionery in Illinois and created that web of entrepreneurial connections. The thing that's really neat about this book is that her sister ended up buying the abandoned confectionery and open it up again and actually have the original fixings and this part of their, anyway, I won't get into it. Okay, so very quickly, the Greek side, let me just flash through it. Mapping villages that were paid by Greeks in Corinth, where the American School works. These are the kind of houses that were paid by Greek immigrants that are abandoned. in the Western Argolid, trying to figure out exactly what is it that they contained. In some of them, you have date stones that give the name of the person who paid it, very often an absentee immigrant. And some of them have the inscription phonetically America in Greek, which is totally fascinating. It's like someone who is paying for a house that they'll never enjoy, making sure that the local craftsman, who's from there, of course, a local mason, is going to tell everyone that this was made by American money. Anyway, so these are the kind of projects with students in Greece, drones and mapping, and I won't get into the details. 3D modeling of these houses to fill in the blank objects, and of course interviews. These are the anyway, I won't get into the details. And very often these wonderful objects like RCA record players or sewing machines that are passed on. Yes, here's okay, forget it. I'll just go through this very quickly. Trying to figure out what happens when a village is abandoned. A little too technical and certainly not the Parthenon, but something that I think will give us the answer to these links, to these transnational links. Here's one of the churches in a village that's part of the Western Argolid Survey, a project from the University of Colorado and others. And if you look really closely, you see that the bell tower says, it was built in 1926, paid for by the American community. I know I'm running, I'm testing your patience. Can I do 5 more minutes, you think, or maybe 2 more minutes? I want to show you then the reason why I'm so apologetic about the work in Lancaster and Harrisburg is because, especially over COVID, I live in Philadelphia, and so therefore my COVID time was spent much more there than here. So much of the research in Southeastern Pennsylvania was in the big capital city, where we have also a lot more information about other communities. You may remember Philadelphia was the first case study for the study of an African-American neighborhood by no other scholar than W.E. Du Bois. I'll show you in a second. And the picture here's the Housing Authority 1922. It's kind of mapping those ethnic clusters. And those of you that know Philadelphia will know quite well, like number 3. That's the big African-American neighborhood. That's the Harlem along Lombard Street. Do you know that Chinatown is somewhere over here, very close to the red light district, or you know that the Jewish core was right along this, in yellow, right along this line. And then, of course, blue is South Philly, Italy. And each one of these ethnic groups are placed there, and they're using the city because of their professional niche, but I won't get into any of the details. So right in there, number 1 is Philadelphia's Greektown. So you might think, as they'd be all living in Greektown. That's what the oral history, the memories. So we took the 1920 census and we mapped out all the 1,700 Greek-speaking residents and noticed that, oh my gosh, they're like all over the place. And why are they all over the place? Because they're starting little shops along the the newly built train line, or they're exploring growth. This remains the core, the old Greek town around St. George Cathedral from 1922. Very interesting building, Episcopal church, built in 1820s. And here's my students working with the archives of St. George Cathedral and then going to the villages and trying to make a connection. We're studying Greektown more intensively. We take the census, as I mentioned. We try to figure out exactly what these addresses are and plot them on the map. We, of course, because of urban renewal, we can't find the houses, but we can use fire insurance maps and put them back in. So we can now put the actual individuals back in the row houses and see. Sometimes some of the ones in yellow are the ones that survived urban renewal. So we can actually have a place we can visit and go in, knock on the door, and you do have this really interesting model here in Lancaster and in Philadelphia, where there's no tenements, but it's basically they're taking the 19th century row house infrastructure that was intended as a single family, and then dividing it up into different apartments. And very often what you have is these really interesting entrepreneurs, once again, often run as usual by female, who rents out rooms to all the Greeks that are coming into Philadelphia. And of course, Philadelphia, we forget, it's not as well known as Ellis Island, but it's one of the major incoming ports. Anyway, so working with the Greek American Heritage Society of Philadelphia, which is a very committed organization, and helping them also engage with the organizations like the Pennsylvania Historical Society or LancasterHistory.org, and keep those family stories both, close to your heart, but also assuring that it becomes available to future scholars. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania is particularly important because it has inherited what was known as the Balch Institute, which is an early institute that collected immigrant histories, driven by the need to retain the Jewish story of Philadelphia. The Jewish narrative is, because of, the fleeing of Eastern Europe because of pogroms. So the Jewish story in Philadelphia is a much more traumatic story than the Greek is, although the Greek one is pretty traumatic. And also with the Holocaust and what evolves there, there's a much greater commitment to not forgetting. So therefore, the Jewish American institutions are the model, I think, for ethnic community. So the Balch Institute started collecting primarily Jewish, but then also everybody else because they knew they would disappear. And the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is now whose board of directors is also in the trustees of Franklin and Marshall, is the place where you can do ethnic history. So we've got access to the church records. Our students have photographed the baptismal, very difficult to read baptismal records. We decoded some of them. The great thing about church records, unlike demographic census records, is they tell you where everybody's from, because when you are getting married or getting baptized, there's this sort of obsession about, maintaining your source of origin. You see Zidzina, for example, that's the village that built that network of Achaeans, not very far from Blachokerasia. Anyway, or even being able to do things along so here's the death records. As you can see, there's like 3 Greeks die every year, or at least 3 Greeks get buried in the church, have a funeral in the church. I'm sure there's more that don't. And then all of a sudden, 1918, you have this really fascinating spike. This is really interesting to do around COVID, like to see what's the record of the Spanish flu within the working class communities of Philadelphia. And then doing oral histories like we've done here in Lancaster. Here is, well, I won't get into the details. It's this lady right here holding the photograph. This is the house that she grew up in, see, which has been demolished, but through city records, we're able to find images of those houses before they were demolished in urban renewal. And in some cases, find videos of the first visit back to the States of newlyweds, allowing us to go back to the villages and interview the families that on the other side and get kind of both sides of the story and compare. Like, here is where they live in Philadelphia. This is the mill that they paid for. What's the connection? Can we bridge that geographical divide? Here's a photograph in St. George Cathedral, but also to remind us that that any kind of chemical or metabolic process, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it happens within the environment of the neighborhood. So we think that, like comparing Harrisburg and Lancaster, the material and the other kind of groups that are sharing edges with that particular ethnic settlement is very important in what happens to that particular community. So, for example, the Greek town is surrounded, or St. George Cathedral, super important monument, is surrounded by the synagogue, the Russian synagogue, which interestingly enough looks very Byzantine. And this is another fascinating thing, so Byzantine is a style that is not very popular by Greeks in the early 20th century. And part of the reason is that the Byzantine style has already been co-opted by Protestant American churches and by progressive Jewish communities. Anyway, or Mother Bethel, the mother of Bethel Church here, one of the oldest African-American communities, literally around the corner. So once you put the people back in the map and the institutions, you see, for example, here you have the Locust Street African-American mission, which is a Quaker mission around the Greek church. Or you have the oldest Jewish cemetery, Mikveh Israel, where Rebecca Gratz is buried, who went to Franklin and Marshall when women theoretically weren't even part of Franklin and Marshall. Anyway, so here she's buried right here. And of course, here, so Greektown is here, right? And south of Pine Street, you have this amazing study from the 1890s, a door-by-door survey by W.B. Du Bois. So what we found, however, what's fascinating in the historical record is that in 1908, the Greek community embraces an African-American Episcopal deacon and who's interested in orthodoxy as a kind of pan-African, pan-Christian phenomenon. And they send him to Constantinople to get ordained, and he becomes an African-American priest in the Philadelphia community, completely forgotten by all the records. I even found I have this amazing photo I didn't include of Christmas services where Father Morgan is is sitting right next to the Greek Orthodox priest, and which of course explains something that I know that Lancaster's Greek community is very much invested in, is the role of the Greek community in the civil rights movement. Many of you may know that Archbishop Iakovos was one of the few clerics that accompanied Martin Luther King in Selma. And now that historical narratives about Iakovos are coming out, he didn't express the voice of the Greek community. I think one might argue he was an outlier. I think most Greeks in the 1960s would not be supportive of the civil rights movement. And we have these lenses in Lancaster where there was a lot of engagement, or Philadelphia where there was engagement, but that's not really the story. Anyway, let's move on. And to finish up with cigarettes, the Greek business directories, let's pick one of them, the Stefano brothers, like the Anargyros in New York. They are a cigarette factory in downtown Philadelphia on 10th and Locust. Here's where they start off, in one of the little streets. Here's an interview of the fourth generation of the Stefano family. They become one of the richest. They sell the company in the 60s to Philip Morris, of course, but they are really one of the richest families Greek families in the U.S. At some point, they buy a private island in Bahamas, so even in this catalog, in this business director from 1904. It says, a quarter of all the Greeks in Philadelphia are employed by the Stefano brothers factory, right? It's here, so we can go back to Greece now and identify the modest house where the Stefanos were born before they immigrated in Ioannina, in Epirus. And then through, finding their immigration records, see all the steps along their journey, we can look at other startups like the Frank Politis Florist Company. We haven't talked about flowers, but this is a lot of artistry and a lot of sort of design to go in. In fact, this floral shop was exactly halfway between John Wanamaker's house on 21st and Walnut and John Wanamaker's store. So Mr. Wanamaker would stop at Mr. Politis every day and buy a flower and put in his lapel. Mr. Wanamaker did not have a lapel. So you have aspirations or connections between a kind of a lower level entrepreneur and of course the higher level entrepreneur. Here's the Wanamaker store, of course, which also the thing that is, and I'll leave you with this image, the thing that's really interesting is that part of the progressive idea of Mr. Wanamaker was that he would do the social services of his employees, that they would compensate them properly, but also he would be a kind of a spiritual force in the city. So this idea that the commerce can be spiritual. So every Christmas and Easter, you'd have, the famous Christmas show that still goes on today. And I want to show you this one painting in 1865 that was bought by Mr. Wanamaker. And then he would put it in the middle of his department store. And of course, it's a crucifixion. It's a Hungarian painter, a very popular print to also distribute. So when we're working with the Greek community at St. George Cathedral and trying to figure out the different artworks and icons, and there's always been a set of murals that were done in the 1930s that are very Western, not Byzantine at all. So we kind of looked at a lot of the icons were bought from Greece. So it's kind of an interesting transmission. At what point do we have resident, like William Basiotis, like Greek American born intellectuals, right? Not just restaurateurs, not just making it by, but the next generation who's able to in some way give voice to that experience. And we find these, for example, are made in Mount Athos, kind of crazy stuff. This is St. George. Byzantine art in Greece in the 1910s is not very Byzantine. Church art is very Western. It's only until the 1930s that Byzantine becomes kind of popular, rediscovered in Greece. So the stylistic kind of signature of Byzantine dome architecture and the Byzantine mosaic style is a kind of an invention in some way of the modern period, after many, many years where academic art was very Western. But I'll leave it at that. So here's the gigantic mural in the back, and we realize that the muralist is basically copying John Wanamaker's painting that every parishioner would see at Christmas every year. And we're wondering, what the heck is that supposed to mean, right? I have no answer for you. Like, is the Greek trained artist, who's very good in the other paintings and uses other models, is he told to do something that is happening around the corner in a department store? No one in the kind of the history of the community, no one ever kind of realized that that was the case. I think, as is the case in most Greek communities, this is considered to be like, oh, this is embarrassing. Why can't we just rip this up and do something Byzantine, because this is not Greek? Anyway, so here's the, we can do research on the actual factory. The Stefanos built this huge factory right around the corner from where Jefferson University Library is. And in fact, it's the factory that somehow like created the center for some of the other religious institutions. The Stefanos were in fact paying for the churches. One of the reasons why the churches split is not only because of the political divisions, but because many Greeks did not want to be under the kind of the finger of the single patron. One of the most famous cigarettes of the time, if you were smoking in the 1920s, the aristocrat of cigarettes, with beautiful Washington's home as a, and then the estate in which the Stefanos lived. Here is them having an Easter celebration of the entire community at the back of this Elkins Park grand estate. And the second brother has a house around the corner, which is also so anyway, I want to finish with that image and this level of art and architecture, and also consider that another frontier that we need to break is to realize that not every that Greeks were not simply part of a kind of a massive movement of people that were serving kind of the necessities of the workforce, but they changed the American city through the medium of commerce, through sweet shops, floral shops, but they also, to the extent that they could, participated in the major architectural and artistic conversations of their time. And those stories have also been kind of forgotten in this kind of mass exodus away from the city into the kind of isolated and in some way much more safe suburbs. And of course, one might say that this is something that happens in every community. Don't you want to leave the hard times behind and move on and do do something that's less painful? And anyway, so that's the kind of the research that one could have in thinking of the City Beautiful movement now literally as buildings that are at the caliber of the Siemel and Urban, and perhaps at the kind of lower orders of the executive decisions that are made by John Wanamaker and others in Southeastern Pennsylvania.